Meeting. Today is Tuesday, August 3rd, 2021. We have a pretty jam-packed schedule today. But before we get into that, I just wanted to go over what the meeting's all about and everything. And generally, we meet on the first Tuesday of the month. We may move this timing for the India, China, Australia folks on the other side of the world. No plans at the moment, but if people think we should for the next one or one in a meeting or two, please let us know. Topics are driven from prior meetings or requests to me, so go ahead and send me any topics at any time. We've got a couple already lined up for the next time. And discussions don't have to be about Podman itself, but anything about Builda, Scopio, or related container projects. During the meeting today, I'll be taking notes in the HackMD with this link here. It's also in the chat in Blue Jeans. Feel free to go ahead and correct me, especially if I make any spelling errors on your name or somebody else's name. The topics today, we've got a big amount of them today. So the first one's me. I've just got a couple of quick announcements. Then Matt's going to be doing the Podman Run Requires demo. Charlie will be doing a Podman Image SCP demo. Paul will be talking about rootless Docker Compose status. Ashley will be talking about Podman Secrets Environment demo. And there's still more. And then Dan's got 3 of them as well. He's got them for rootless Podman with rootless overlay, Podman Run Group Add, Podman Etsy host containers internal support. And then hopefully we'll have time for some open forums and questions and answers, and we'll be wrapping up right around noontime. So without any further ado, I will just make my 2 quick announcements that we're starting on today. And that is, if you haven't seen it, we have created 2 Twitter handles. They're podman_io and builda_io for each of the projects. And we're planning to announce all the releases and other news and fun facts out through there. So please, if you're on Twitter, go ahead and follow us there. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we'll turn it over to the first person, Matt. It's all yours.
Sorry about that, having some technical difficulties here. Let's see if I can share my screen. And can everyone see a ASCII enemy here? And is the text size okay?
Looks good.
All right, so just a brief description of what I'll be demoing here with Podman 3.3.0. We now have a new flag, --requires added. This allows you to add requirement containers, which are containers that must be started before a specific container will be started. And we will automatically start all of these for you when you do a Podman start. So if you have container 1 that requires container 2 and you start container 1 will automatically start container 2 before it starts itself. We've done this for a while now with pods. All pods have an infra container, and the infra container auto starts when any container in the pod is started. But now we've expanded it so that you can specify them yourself. Let's do a quick demo here. And this will be new as of 3.3.0, although again, we've had something similar in Podman backend for quite a while. And let's start off by making a container that can be required by another container. And really, it doesn't matter what this first container looks like. You can use any container's requirement. Practically speaking, it's probably going to be something like a database container, and then your second container that requires it will be your HTTP server. And now let's make another container that requires this. Not going to look much different than that first one, except we're going to add the --requires flag, which takes either a name or an ID. And I'm pretty sure that you can specify that flag as many times as you want, so you're not limited to one dependency. And if you want to nest dependencies, if you had a 3rd layer here that required test2, that would also work just fine. So let's go ahead and do a quick start on the test2 container, and we'll see both containers pop on. And you can see there that we only listed one of the containers. That's something I really need to fix, but both of them did actually start there. So we do need to fix the start command to list all the containers that were started. And there are a few other limitations in that we will not wait for the container that we start to be operational before we launch the second container. So if there was a health check on one, I'd like eventually to be able to wait for the health check on test one to confirm clean, so we don't start the web server container, say, before the database server is actually operational. So that is something that we're going to be looking into in the future. And there are some quirks around how -rm works with these containers right now, but that's something we are also looking to fix. So that's about it. Any questions?
So if I remove test container, if I stop container test 1, will test 2 be stopped?
No. So this is only for starting. That would require health checks, which health checks that can take action are another thing that we want to do, but also another thing that needs time, effort to get done. But yeah.
And if I'm not allowed to remove test 1 unless I remove test 2, right?
Yeah, I was talking about the quirks in RM. That's basically it. The biggest one you'll notice is that RM-all basically needs to be run twice, once to get rid of everything except test 1, and then once to get rid of test 1, which is annoying. That's something I definitely need to fix.
Okay.
All right, I don't think we have any other questions. Thanks, Matt. So next up on our list, we have Podman image SCP demo from Charlie. Go ahead, Charlie, take it away.
All right, I'm just going to share my screen really quick. All right, you guys should be seeing a terminal. Can you see that?
Yep, just popped up. And it looks
All right.
good.
So I'm just going to play a little demo that I created for image SCP. So image SCP can copy images to and from remote hosts, as we discussed in the last Community Cabal. It can also copy images to and from remote host to remote host. So I'm going to show you all the different functionalities of that. So first I SSH into a remote machine, which is going to take a second because I have to type out the whole IP. And I just list the images to show that I'm going to be putting Alpine on there. So Alpine in this list, as you can see, is not there. So then next I'm going to Podman image SCP, Alpine to, so fed. So what this uses is the Podman system connection list. So fed is something that I previously created using Podman system connection add. You can also do just as I did up here with Charlie Dorn 192 whatever. I can specify that as well with the Podman socket at the end of it. That'll also work. I think I have that later in a different cast. So this is going to be that, and then what it does takes a second because it has to SSH in, and then it loads it on the remote machine. If I SSH back in and do the image list again, as you can see, the first image up here is Alpine. So it successfully loaded it. Under the covers, we use SSH and SCP protocols, and I call on the remote machine Podman image load after saving it on there as well. That's the first command. Then I'm going to do kind of the opposite, where this machine, I'm removing Alpine locally to prove that it actually loads it on, and then I'm going to do the reverse. So I'm going to do SCP fed : Alpine. So what that means is that you're going into the remote machine, looking for Alpine, saving it, passing it over SSH, and then loading it on the local machine. So it should just take a second. Then it loads it on here. Looks pretty similar. And if you go to the image list, Alpine is there. So it has the same functionality. You can do to or from. Then I think I have a couple more things. I think I do a remote to remote, which is pretty cool as well, because you can avoid registries. Both ways you can avoid registries, which I think is the coolest part of it. What I'm going to do here is fed Alpine to fed. And yes, this is like kind of useless because it's the same machine, but I don't have multiple machines I could have SSH'd into. So it works with any number of machines. It could be Fed 1, Fed 2, or Fed and rel. So in this one, I'm doing on the first machine, it's the Fedora laptop, getting the image Alpine, putting it on my local machine, and then copying it again the other remote machine. So you don't see too much with this one purposely because the save and the load all happen remotely. So all you get is the loaded images response as you got up here, but you don't get the save because on both of these other ones, some sort of operation is happening on your local machine versus here, you just get the responses. And I think, oh yeah, this is just me saying that remote to remote works with different machines as well. But for this example, I just did the same machine. And that's it for this one. And then I have another one if I have time. But first I can ask questions as well. Does anyone have any questions on the basic functionality of image SCP?
Can I do local to local? So can I copy from root to my home directory and off my home directory to root yet?
For V1, the two things that we don't have are root to local, so no, and renaming. So those are the two things that I'm going to go back and add and figure out, because if I was to do, you can do local, because the code path is in there right now, where you just do image SCP Alpine, and it'll just do the equivalent of a load and a save. So it doesn't do much, but the code path is in there to for that functionality, because I believe that if you wanted to do root to local, it would basically use that with a little modification. So I'm going to go back with a V2 once we see what breaks in this one and add that functionality. So I have, I forget what it's called, but I have one more. Yeah, so this is just an extra thing just to show you that you can also do a direct SSH URL. So it takes a second to type out, but you can type the user, the IP, the port, and then you have to also specify the, I don't know why it's doing that. Weird. But you have to specify the Podman socket as well. And then what it does is it warns you that the connection you gave is unknown with Podman system connection, and it urges you to add it, which you don't have to do. You could just ignore that. But it just makes it's really easy to do Podman system connection add. You add the equivalent of what I just typed with a name, and then you just use that name from now on. And then you can do the same thing. So that one was loading Alpine to that URL, and you can. It's kind of a long thing you have to type out. You can also load Alpine from there as well. Other covers. My typing's not really that fast. Then you have to specify the socket, because what system connection does is it checks that the socket is there. So that's why you have to specify it, and you need to make sure the Podman's obviously running on the machine that you're doing Podman load and Podman save on. So this is loading Alpine from there, and then it warns you again. As you can see, the output's a little different because this load bar, we think that's a bug in load, I think it is, because it shouldn't return that. This is the response from the machine. But you can see it's doing different things because it's different. And then one thing I wanted to show is that what happens if you specify an invalid connection. So image SCP, I don't know what I say, foobar, and then image name. And then it says failed to dial because foobar is not a valid connection name, obviously. So that's that. If anyone has any questions, I can take those. But I think it's a pretty cool feature overall. I think the way of avoiding registries can be used in interesting ways if you want to have a cluster of machines that have the same image, but you don't want to push and pull to a remote registry. So, yeah.
So
I know you've been asked in the past, why use the double colons for like foobar : Alpine rather than foobar : Alpine? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the double colon is basically differentiate between image tag and connection name image, because in the parsing of arguments, we look for a colon to say like Alpine latest or Alpine whatever. So the double colon just helps us. It's much easier if we to parse that argument with a double versus a single, and it also helps you understand what you're typing as well. So like if we had, eventually we're going to have tags and you can have renaming with this feature. So we're going to be using single colons a lot. So to have the double colon definitely would help the readability.
All right, so my only comment is you're going to make this a lot better for human beings so that they don't have to type in :22/run/user/podman/podman.socket because computers know this crap and humans don't need to know this crap. So
yeah, I mean, right now it's I was just showing that because
right.
you have to do it at one point, either with Podman system connection add or this, and this is just to show that it's probably easier for everyone to specify it with Podman system connection add. But yeah, we can definitely make it so that if it's rootless or if it's root, the run user whatever is pre-filled in that regard. So yeah, I can add that as well. So the three things that I'm going to be working on in the future are the user interface, which is clunky, but it's kind of a clunky feature because it can do so many different things, and tags, so you can like rename the image. So if I was doing like image SCP Alpine to Fedora : new name, so you could rename it, and the root to localhost, kind of getting the images from the two different users would be important as well. So that's what I'm going to be working on.
And root to localhost is going to go over sudo versus going over SSH.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. All right. Nobody else has any questions. I think I'm all set.
Thanks, Charlie. I couldn't unmute. Next up, Paul Halsinger, rootless Docker compose status. You want to take it away, Paul?
Okay. All right. You see the terminal?
Yep.
Okay. So I want to look at rootless Docker Compose. Basically, with the release of Podman 3.2, we can now run Docker Compose against the rootless socket. So first off, we have to check if the socket is running. And as rootless, you always need to the -- user for systemctl. And right now it's not enabled. So we first start the socket. And then we can use Docker Compose. And if you now use Docker Compose, it will fail because by default it connects to the rootful socket, which the rootless user cannot access. So to change this, we need to export the Docker host variable. And with that, I have a Docker Compose file here, a simple one with a WordPress container with a MySQL DB. And now we simply can run Docker Compose up and it will start. And it will not start because we see the WordPress container has port 80 exposed. I tries to forward this, and the rootless user can obviously not bind to port 80 by default. So let's change this to something which the rootless user has access to. Just remove the old container and try again. So this time it worked, and now we should be able to see in the browser the page. So the container is there and working. So one thing with rootless is that by default the we don't have network privileges on the host, so the IP is not routable. So you can only do port forwards. If we try to do a Podman inspect, Podman container inspect. See, there was a good. So we get the IP in here, and so this is the IP assigned to the container. And with rootful, you could just like curl the IP. But right now it tries to connect to this IP, which it doesn't find. So if you need to connect directly to IPs instead of using the forwarded ports, there's the Podman unshare command with the rootless CNI flag, which allows you to join the rootless CNI namespace, and with that, so we need to follow the forwarded. So now you can connect to this IP. So rootless Docker Compose should work like your usual rootful Docker Compose with some limitations, which are the same limitations as rootless Podman. So there is the link on GitHub with all the rootless limitations, such as like what I showed with binding the port below 1024. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Any questions?
Looks good.
Yeah, looks good. Thank you. I forgot to ask Charlie, could you add your ASCII Cinema link to the notes? And Paul, if you could add anything pertinent that might think be useful folks to the notes as well. The links, that'd be great. And next up, we have Ashley talking about Podman secrets and the environment option. Ashley, it's all yours.
Okay, I'm sharing my screen. So basically, a little while back, we added a few more options to Podman secrets. So some more ways to use secrets. You can change the UID, GID, and mode of the secret inside of the container. So if I create a secret called my secret with hello inside of it, I can use a secret in a Podman run. And then you can see that this secret has a UID of 1000, a GID of 1001, and then you can also see the mode has changed from the default. And then with environment variable, so you can create a secret from an environment variable. So if I export var equals ABC, I can create a secret from the environment variable using the --env flag. So I don't have to have it in a file or reading it from standard in. We can just grab it directly from environment variable that we have set. So that's creating the secret right there. And then we can also use the secret as an environment variable inside of the container. This is not exclusive to environment variables or secrets that are created from environment variables. This is just like another way to use a secret inside the container. So if we mount it with type equals env, we can see that if we do printf another secret, which is the name of the secret up here, we can see ABCs inside that secret. Yeah, that's about it. Does anybody have any questions? Okay.
I'm gonna make you that secret will not be saved to the image.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
As opposed to other environment variables that you could pass in that would be saved to the image.
Yeah. That's the difference between a secret environment variable and a regular environment variable.
Okay.
Question is the value of the environment variable stored in the container at container creation time or run time?
Container creation time.
Okay, so if you update var to CDE, that will not be picked up at Podman runtime. Thank you.
No. Everything in secrets is at create time. So even if you change the environment variable locally, it'll not update the secret. And then if you change the secret, if you deleted the secret and then created another secret and you decide to run the container again, it won't pick up anything, whether it's an environment variable secret or a regular secret.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Dan, you're up next. You've got 3 of them coming in at us. Go ahead and take it.
Okay. Okay, let me see if I can remember what I'm supposed to be talking about here.
Rootless Podman with rootless overlay.
Okay, so for those that don't know, ever since Podman started working with rootless, we've been using overlay file system as the backing store of your system, and this is pretty simple. As of -r, as of 5.13 kernels, might have been 5.12 kernels. Podman now discovers if it can run rootless mode with regular overlay instead of diffuse overlay. So if you do, if I did a Podman run, Fedora Sleep 1000, and run it in the background, ps-use rep for fuse. Look, no fuse overlay. So there's no fuse overlay running on the system now. And if I did a Podman info, you'd see down here, ordinarily on older systems, you'd see under graph options. Here you would see something that talked about fuse overlay, and that doesn't exist anymore. And so I'm using standard overlay. Why is this important? Well, fuse overlay added a lot of overhead, especially if you're doing things like builds or anything that would be hammering the containers image, or basically the container image storage, the overlay driver. So people that are doing things like creating huge files, things like that, you'd be talking to process, the fuse overlay process, and the fuse overlay process would then be relaying that to the kernel to write to the disk. And so anything that involves a lot of reads and writes would fuse overlay would end up taking up a lot of your CPU. And now that basically all that CPU overhead of fuse overlay has disappeared. Now, fuse overlay still is going to be useful, and we will plan on using it in the future for different types of environments. But now that we have rootless overlay support, we don't need that anymore. So it's kind of a big feature that most people won't notice. There is one potential problem with that. If fuse overlay, one of the changes that was made to the Linux kernel is now you can do a make node 0, 0. I'm not going to actually do it. So basically creating device nodes in your home directory has never been allowed in the past. You need a cat make node to be able to do that. But the kernel has a special feature now that allows you to create device node 0, 0 as rootless users without having a cat make node. That is the way that overlay uses to basically define a deleted directory. So they create device nodes. If you have an underlying directory and you want to remove it, or an underlying file and you want to remove it, what fuse overlay driver is doing is it's creating device nodes to indicate that there was a directory there and it's been deleted, or a file there that was deleted in the upper directory. And it does that via device nodes. Fuse overlay, because it wasn't allowed to do that until more recently, created a different type of indicator. So there could be upgrade problems when you upgrade when you upgrade your kernel, and Fuse Podman suddenly starts using the overlay driver versus an older Fuse overlay driver. Now, Fuse overlay more recently will also use the make node if it's able to do that. But basically, if you run a kernel that doesn't support it, then fuse overlay will create a different type of it's called basically a different kind of indicator for remove directories. So there is potential for risk, and we're trying to work on ways to mitigate this as we go forward. But right now, that risk exists. So the second thing I'm supposed to talk about is group add. So what I did here, one interesting problem in rootless environments is when you have a directory that is shared to users via what's called supplemental group ID. So here I've created a directory called var-eng, and you'll notice here that the eng directory, basically I have read-write access via if you're in the eng group. So if I ran a container, let's do this first. So if I run a container like this in the host, and I try to list the contents of var-eng, I'm going to get permission denied. Now, if I go outside the directory and look at the contents of var-eng, you'll see that I can see the contents as a rootless user, and I set up the SE Linux, so this is not SE Linux causing the issue. And I can even go in there and I can create files for. So the problem is when I want to run a container that I want to share this content that a rootless user has to it, how am I allowed to do that? So what's going on here, the reason I have access to it is I am in the eng group. So I have eng group, but when I go in and run a container, one of the first things we do is we want to eliminate access to the groups the user has. For instance, we don't really want to, I'm also a member of the whale group, which allows me to get to sudo, and we really don't want containers to get access to that. So by default, containers drop all groups when you run them. So what I can do to override that function now is I can do a groups add equals keep groups. And what this does is instead of getting rid of all the default groups from my home directory, I can go in, group add. So now I've entered the container, and suddenly now I can look at the contents of the directory, and you can see all the contents, and I can even go in and create more content. So basically by doing keep groups, I've basically passed in my groups from the host into the container. The strange thing is if I do a groups call now, you'll see that I am now root, which is root inside the user namespace. But the eng group that was passed in is going to be treated as the nobody group because the eng group is not mapped into the user namespace, but still I have access to it. So it's kind of a strange behavior, but this allows us. We also see the need for leaking in group IDs when using things like HPC environments and sharing devices. So certain devices you have access to via group access, and this is the only way that you can get group access. There is an effort to make this better in the Linux kernel, but that hasn't happened as of yet. So this is our workaround for that. And the last topic I'm supposed to cover is, there's a new flag, a new entry in the operating system called host containers internal. And this basically allows, if you have an application running inside of your container and you don't know, what the name of the container is going to be, and you don't know what the IP addresses that are going to run with, you can actually set up. We always are defining now a Etsy host entry that points to the IP address of the machine. So you can do Podman run Fedora ping of hosts.containers.internal. And of course, what did I do wrong? I guess Fedora doesn't ship with the ping. So basically, you're always guaranteed that host IP, that host name will always resolve to the container's address if you use that. So you can build containers with that hard-coded. And that's it. I guess at this point, I'll open up to any questions.
I had a bunch today. All right, that's all that we had for the prepared presentations for today. Are there any questions or topics for the next meetings from anybody? Or I didn't know if Matt or Dan or Brent, if you want to say anything about Podman 3.3 and where it's at and what's happening with that.
Sure, I can go a bit on that. So we released 3.3 RC1 on Monday. This is a very early release candidate. It doesn't even have release notes yet. But we are expecting to do an RC2 sometime early-ish next week with proper release notes and a few more essential backports. I would consider us almost feature frozen at this point. We'll probably get a few more features in the next few weeks. But we are branched, and we are in a good spot, I would say, for release mid to late August. So we'll have a few more weeks worth of release candidates. The next one that comes with actual release notes, we'll make sure to get that out to the mailing list so people can actually try it.
Everything we've shown today, including the Podman image SCP, should be in Podman 3.3. I think we also should point out that if you're following along with our releases now, the main branch has switched to Podman 4.0. The main reason we're switching to Podman 4.0 at this point is we're going to be allowing breaking changes to get in. So you'll see some changes to the API and other parts of Podman to allow that. So we might have to deal with, we're not sure if Podman 3.3 is the last of the Podman 3 releases. There could potentially be a 3.4, but we want to allow people to start working on Podman 4.0 and start to commit some changes to that. Podman 4.0, we're looking at coming out a decent amount in the future, so it would not be, in fact, Podman 4.0 will never be released to Fedora 34. So maybe if it makes it into Fedora 35, it could, but we'll see. Anything else?
I just wanted to note, in case folks hadn't seen the announcements, and Dan just mentioned it offhand just a moment ago, is that we no longer have a master branch for Podman or Builder or most of our other projects, as far as I know. We've all switched over to main there to be a little more inclusive for people. Very quiet. Dan, anything else that you wanted to talk about today? No? Or Brent?
No, I was actually hoping that I could get like Matt and Dan and Valentin and you, and generally the internal team to hang after this.
Sure thing. Well then, since we seem to be running down on topics and people wanting to ask questions, I'll just note that got a couple of meetings coming up. Our next Cabal meeting, which is where we do design discussions, is coming up on Thursday, August 19th. That's at 10 a.m. That's in a different room than this, and there's information on the website for that, podman.io. And then our next Podman community meeting will be on Tuesday, September 7th at 11 a.m. Eastern, and we'll be right here back in this room. So given that, I'm going to wrap up the meeting and the recording for this one. Thanks for attending, folks.